Good morning. I don't know what happened just a second ago, but I was trying to do a live video and I went off into the ether. So apparently I was not worthy or something, who knows what. But now here I am live again and attempting a second attempt at this. Hopefully it won't get deep into the video and then flatline me, but we'll see. I have, as I said earlier, my delicious coconut milk in the Killian's beer cup because, beer apparently is off the table now that Mr. Lassiter is making an attempt to go dairyless and gluten-free. And beer apparently is nothing but delicious, marvelous, wonderful gluten and a little color. So anyway, I'm doing this instead. This is the coconut milk taste test, right? Better than Killian's. So anyway, I'm doing that. And here I am on a beautiful fall day in Minneapolis. And it's beautiful out with the wind and the breeze and clear blue sky. And temperature's about 70 degrees. And autumn weather. And what better thing to do on a day like today than to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings? Because what else would you want to do, right? So here we are. I am prepared with my text. This is my own copy I've had since, I don't know, high school roughly. It's all beat up, dog-eared, spine being wrecked. And I picked this up again now that I'm hitting that Rubicon of 50. I picked it up again after reading this execrable article trying to paint Tolkien as this bigot and misogynist and all, and thought, well, Mr. Tolkien needs a little bit more support than that. So I hadn't read him in maybe 2 years. Time to pick him up again. So we started reading him. I came across a passage of Tom Bombadil, and I was reminded of something that came up earlier on Facebook when a friend of mine, Jen Dion, asked a question about Tom Bombadil. And I will probably get this wrong, Jen, so you'll have to correct me if I say it wrong. But the question was whether Tom Bombadil was a parallel for John the Baptist. And at the time, I was in a hurry. I just said no and left it at that. But I didn't really explain myself. So now here's an elaboration of that, if you will, on this live event. So anyway, we'll talk today about Tolkien and what he was about, and about Tom Bombadil, and a little bit about the nature of mythological creation. And if you have questions or comments as we go through, please feel free to enter them down here. And I'll try and answer them. I'll go for roughly 15, 20 minutes, and then I'll try and answer any questions that you might have. As a quick caveat, for those of you who are steeped in the lore of Tolkien, my sister especially, Dr. Helen Free, I apologize beforehand. I will probably screw up names. I will probably get dates wrong. I'll probably get lore wrong, confuse the Ainur, for instance, with the Maya. I'll probably confuse events as they occur in the story, and I apologize for that ahead of time. So mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. But there are some things that I can pass your way in this little discussion. The first thing to note, for any of you who are not familiar with the character of Tom Bombadil, and if you aren't, you should be, this is in the chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring called The Shadow of the Past, and I'll begin there. And I wanted to point out here just quickly about the nature of the ring, because it has bearing on who Tom Bombadil really is. In this chapter, we have Frodo, who is discussing with Gandalf about the nature of the Ring of Sauron. And he points out here that the ring cannot be used for good. It is altogether evil. And basically he says, let's see here where this Here it is. This is page 81. And he says, the beginnings of the ring lie back in the black years, which only the lore masters now remember. And he talks about Sauron the Great and about how the ring is inscribed with letters in the interior which say, one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. The ring is the master ring, and all other rings were crafted in response to it. And it is designed in order to entrap or ensnare the souls of those who wear it. And the reason I bring this up is because everything in the book has some relationship to the ring. When you read the three texts of the Fellowship and then the Two Towers and the Return of the King, they're all of them somehow related to that image of the ring and how the ring affects everybody differently. And Gandalf points out in here that nobody can actually master the ring. He himself won't take it because, as he says, I would want to use it for good. And it cannot be used for good. It is wholly evil. So when Bilbo tries to give it to him, Gandalf says on page 95, with that power I should have power too great and terrible, and over me the ring would gain a power still greater and more deadly. For I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet the way of the ring to my heart is by pity for weakness, and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe, unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. I shall have such need of it. Great perils lie before me. So Gandalf himself says, I can't take the ring because it's too powerful. It would overpower me. Even this extremely powerful character, Gandalf, doesn't want to even touch the ring because he's worried that it will overpower him. So the point being is every figure in the book is somehow connected to the ring, overpowered by the ring. The ring has the strength to be able to control every single character. Tom's response to the ring, Tom Bombadil's response to the ring, then, is an insight into what he is as a character. And so I wanted to bring up Tolkien's description of Tom and then Tom's handling of the ring to see something about what he is. This is further on in the text, and in the chapter called, this is the Old Forest, it is chapter 6. They have been trapped by Old Man Willow. The 4 hobbits have been trapped by Old Man Willow, and they're running about trying to get help. Merry and Pippin are trapped inside Old Man Willow, and Sam and Frodo are calling out for help. And suddenly they hear the singing that comes along. And the text says on page 168, there was another burst of song, and then suddenly hopping and dancing along the path, there appeared above the reeds an old battered hat with a tall crown and a long blue feather stuck in the band. With another hop and a bound, there came into view a man, or so it seemed. At any rate, he was too large and heavy for a hobbit, not quite tall enough for one of the big people, though he made noise enough for one, stumping along with great yellow boots on his thick legs, and charging through grass and rushes like a cow going down to drink. He had a blue coat and a long brown beard. His eyes were blue and bright, and his face was red as a ripe apple, but creased into 100 wrinkles of laughter. In his hands he carried on a large leaf, as on a tray, a small pile of water lilies. So here's this figure, Tom Bombadil, who physically is like a man, a little smaller than a man, huge beard, dressed in blue with giant yellow boots and a large feather coming out of his hat. And he's dressed in colors that are natural colors, like springtime colors, but they're outlandish colors. And he's not described as elegant. He's described as kind of going down like a cow to the water to drink. So he's not elvish, certainly. And he's not a man, really, because he's otherworldly than a man. We find out that he has power over the trees, but it's not power as in they obey him immediately. They're kind of reluctant to obey him. And he ends up having to hit the tree and sing to it and force it to open up reluctantly. And then further on, he protects the hobbits while they're at his home. So his physical demeanor is one of almost like a leprechaun or like a fairy of some kind, but not this winged, delicate, elvish type fairy thing. He's far more like a nature spirit or a natural spirit of some sort. Now, in doing a little bit of research, I found out that one of the inspirations for this apparently was a toy that the son of Tolkien had, Michael Tolkien had, and that Tolkien used the toy in order to create the character. But that gives us some insight. Artists are always creating things from what they see around them. But the same page, which is an authority in my opinion, because it's a fan page, and so fans are rabid about whatever figure they're talking about here. The fan page on Tom Bombadil at lotrfandom.com says the origin and nature of Tom Bombadil are unknown. However, he had already existed when the Dark Lord came to Arda. That's when Sauron came to Arda, the land of the elves, signifying he may have been alive even before the coming of the Valar. However, he may have been speaking in this instance of Melkor's second entry into Arda after he was driven out by the arrival of Tulkas. In any case, he is insinuated to have been the first living creature to inhabit Arda, having witnessed the emergence of the forests and the rain. Tom also claims to have lived in the West before the elves came and the tides were folded. So he's a very old character. He's a character that's been around a long, long, long time. And there are some theories about who he is. Some people speculating, for instance, that he might be one of the Maya. Some people saying that he might be a man. There's even speculation by some people that he might be a Iluvatar himself. Some people who do metatext talk about how he might be the reader, right? So that it's unclear who he is. And this character is one which leaves a vast interpretation open. Tolkien himself had a few words to say about Tom Bombadil, and he said them in a letter, which I encourage everybody to read. I'll try and put the link somewhere. This is a letter that I came across just the other day to Naomi Mitchison, who was one of the, she was a novelist and a memoirist. She was one of the proofreaders of his early text in 1954. And she wrote with several questions to Tolkien, which really excited his thought about his own work. And so he wrote about all the different characters that he was composing, and he answered questions about them. But one of the things that he pointed out about Bombadil was that Bombadil is a unique character. He says here in the letter, Tom Bombadil is not an important person to the narrative. I suppose he has some importance as a comment. I mean, I do not really write like that. He is just an invention, and he represents something that I feel important, though I would not be prepared to analyze the feeling precisely. I would not, however, have left him in if he did not have some kind of function. I might put it this way. The story is cast in terms of a good side and a bad side, beauty against ruthless ugliness, tyranny against kingship, moderated freedom with consent against compulsion that has long lost any object save mere power, and so on. But both sides, in some degree, conservative or destructive, want a measure of control. But if you have, as it were, taken a vow of poverty, renounced control, and take your delight in things for themselves, without reference to yourself, watching, observing, and to some extent knowing, then the question of the rights and wrongs of power and control might become utterly meaningless to you, and the means of power quite valueless. It is a natural pacifist view, which always arises in the mind when there is a war. But the view of Rivendell seems to be that it is an excellent thing to have represented, but that there are in fact things with which it cannot cope, and upon which its existence nonetheless depends. Ultimately, only the victory of the West will allow Bombadil to continue or even to survive. Nothing would be left for him in the world of Sauron. That's kind of interesting, that comment. It seems to indicate that Bombadil is a bit like a Buddhist pacifist, as though he is outside of the realm of the struggle for control that good and evil have in this world. Was Tolkien saying he's the ideal of what we ought to strive for? It doesn't seem that way. Not to me, anyway. Because Bombadil is a character who would not be around if there weren't people who were trying to fight this battle. If, for instance, the men of Westerness were not trying to defeat the Dark Lord would take over and Tom Bombadil would cease to exist. So he, in a way, like the hobbits, is protected by people that he takes for granted, people that are fighting this battle that he himself would never want to fight. There's another passage in here in the book which I think is interesting to look at. This is in the House of Tom Bombadil, chapter 7, and here in the House of Tom Bombadil, they're talking with Goldberry, Tom Bombadil's wife, his woman, and it says here that they ask her, who is Tom Bombadil, right? And she says, he is the master of wood, water, and hill. And they say, well, then all this strange land belongs to him? No, indeed, she answered, and her smile faded. That would indeed be a burden, she added in a low voice, as if to herself. The trees and the grasses and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves. Tom Bombadil is the master. No one has ever caught old Tom walking in the forest, wading in the water, leaping on the hilltops under light and shadow. He has no fear. Tom Bombadil is master. And then in comes Tom Bombadil. And a similar discussion occurs further on when Frodo directly asks Tom Bombadil, who are you? Who are you? This is on page 182 in the same chapter. Who are you, master? Frodo asked. Eh, what? Said Tom, sitting up, and his eyes glinting in the gloom. Don't you know my name yet? That's the only answer. Tell me, who are you alone, yourself and nameless? But you are young and I am old. Eldest, that's what I am. Mark my words, my friends. Tom was here before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. He made paths before the big people and saw the little people arriving. He was here before the kings and the graves and the Barrow-wights. When the elves passed westward, Tom was here already, before the seas were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from outside. So Tom himself, when asked, who are you? He says, I've been around a long time, which doesn't really answer the question, but it does give an insight into the fact that he's been around for eons, for generations. Now, further on, when Frodo is mentioning that he's on this quest, and Tom guesses that he's going to the Dark Lord with the ring. And Frodo's been very secretive about this ring. And suddenly, Tom Bombadil just blurts out, right? Show me the precious ring. It's still in the same chapter, page 184. Show me the precious ring, he said suddenly, in the midst of the story. And Frodo, to his own astonishment, drew out the chain from his pocket, and unfastening the ring, handed it at once to Tom. It seemed to grow larger as it lay for a moment on his big brown-skinned hand. Then suddenly he put it to his eye and laughed. And for a second the hobbits had a vision, both comical and alarming, of his bright blue eyes gleaming through a circle of gold. Then Tom put the ring round the end of his little finger and held it up to the candlelight, And for a moment the hobbits noticed nothing strange about this. And then they gasped. There's no sign of Tom disappearing. See, that's odd because everybody who puts on the ring disappears, right? And Tom Bombadil puts on the ring and he doesn't disappear at all. He stays visible to everybody else. Tom laughed again, then he spun the ring in the air and it vanished with a flash. So not only does Tom not vanish, but when he puts on the ring and then plays with it, it vanishes. Frodo gave a cry, and Tom leaned forward and handed it back to him with a smile. Frodo looked at it closely and rather suspiciously, like one who has lent a trinket to a juggler, and he tests the ring and finds out that it does still work. In fact, he tests and he tries to leave the room with the ring on while he's invisible. He got up and crept quietly away from the fireside towards the outer door. "Hey there," cried Tom, glancing towards him with a most seeing look in his shining eyes. "Hey, come Frodo there, where be ye going? Old Tom Bombadil's not as blind as that yet. Take off your golden ring, your hand's more fair without it. Come back, leave your game, and sit down beside me. We must talk a while more and think about the morning. Tom must teach the right road and keep your feet from wandering." So there's a lot packed in here. When he puts on the ring, Tom doesn't disappear. He's able to make the ring disappear. He's able to see Frodo when Frodo has the ring on. So essentially, Tom is not controlled at all by the ring. And again, the ring is an emblem of power and control, especially total control of everything. It's sort of, in a way, it represents the attempt to make the entire world bend towards your will. Galadriel says this later. She says, "All would worship me and despair," right? So the ring is the focus point of that attempt to control everything. And I read somewhere, I think I posted this, the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is control. When we have faith, that is when we believe in a higher power, or believe that there is a plan, or believe that life is worth living as it is, then we live a life that's happy and free, and we aren't pushed around by the need to control this and to control that. If we don't believe that there is a higher power or a plan or that life is worth living as it is, then what we try to do is we try to control everything and make everything bend towards our own will, at least according to Mr. Tolkien. And this is a very interesting little bit of Tolkien's theology, or philosophy, if you will, about writing itself. In the last live episode that I did, we talked a little bit about what's called mythopoeic speculation, which is the frequent attempt, the frequent project of human beings to take old stories and recast them in a new mode. Tolkien was certainly doing this, but he was often asked, what does this figure correspond to, or that figure correspond to? Does Tom Bombadil correspond to John the Baptist? And Tolkien is very explicit in this, and he says, I'm not writing allegory, I'm creating myth. And what's the difference between the two? Allegory is a direct embodiment of a philosophy or of an idea. The easiest example to come by is Pilgrim's Progress, for instance. It's a great work. But Pilgrim's Progress, the characters themselves are named after the thing that they embody, right? Pilgrim himself, the main character, is a pilgrim in the world. That's what he embodies, and he's named that. Allegory, the characters are direct relations to the thing they represent. Mythology is different from that. Mythology is a a story that embodies an overarching idea or an overarching philosophy, and then the characters within that embodiment have a sort of life of their own, responding to the philosophy or conveying the philosophy, I suppose you could say. Tolkien liked to use the term secondary world. And a secondary world is one where the author has a certain amount of control over the characters. That is, he's certainly the one who writes about them, but in some ways they take on a life of their own. They may not even have direct bearing on the story itself. They may just be there because the author likes to create them. What purpose do they serve? Well, what purpose, not to be too philosophically Buddhist here, but what purpose does a flower serve? What purpose does a stone serve? What purpose does a cloud that's way up there in the sky serve? The answer is, there is no purpose. It simply is. It exists. And in a Buddhist philosophy, existence itself is complete in itself. It doesn't have to have any purpose or end goal or telos or meaning. There is no meaning, for instance, in the bird. There is no meaning, for instance, in the sun. It just simply is. And I think this is what Tolkien is getting at in the character. That the Tom Bombadil character doesn't have, oh, hi, Kevin. The Tom Bombadil character does not have a direct bearing on the journey Frodo has to make. But he has a direct bearing on the philosophy or the idea that Tolkien is getting across. He is a sort of an insight into a reflection, a peaceful reflection on what this being removed from the whole cycle of dark and light, the whole cycle of control, being removed from that, so that he is not a character who's trying to impose his will for evil or impose even the structure for good. He simply is delighting in the world around him. So whether he is Maiar or a man or Iluvatar, the creator of the whole world, that may not be the question. The question may be, does he represent something in this world that is like that may simply exist for the sake of its own existence? Well, one of the things that's startling to me is that Tom Bombadil constantly talks in poetry. Everything he says, even his prose, is poetic. And I'm going to say something which might tick off the Tolkien lovers here. I'm not a fan of Tolkien's poetry. I mean, I find his literature to be one of the greatest works of the 20th century, no doubt about it. But I'm not a fan of his poetry. He writes in this da 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 da, which gets kind of repetitive and sometimes can be tedious. But it's very obvious that he loves poetry. It's very obvious that he himself was familiar with poetry, especially the Anglo-Saxon poetry of the balanced line, the what do they call it? The syllabic rhyme that goes on. He was very familiar with that. So he embodies that throughout the work. Everybody's quoting poetry, singing songs all the time. Tom Bombadil never stops singing. Even his language, his literary prose is poetry. He's poetic constantly. And that gets me to thinking about what he might be. Is it possible, I'm just throwing this out there, is it possible that what he is or represents is something connected to poetry? Because what's the purpose of poetry? It's not. There's a movie I hate called The Dead Poets Society, where Robin Williams says that poetry exists in order to get women, and I just my gorge rises at that, because it's simply not true. Poetry exists because it exists. It exists because human beings use words. And the primary way in which we seem to use words is in this poetic construction, not prosaic construction. That it seems almost like our protean language is one of poetic poetic language. Certainly Tolkien seems to be aware of this because he was a philologist. He was a studier of words. And he seems to be very aware of the idea that our words have to them a rich history and a rich cadence and a rich symbolism in and of themselves. So to use words for poetry doesn't serve any practical purpose at all, nor is there any control. When a really great poet creates a line of poetry, he is definitely controlling the words to a certain degree. But he's not creating the poem in order to control other people, nor is he creating the poem in order to effect an end. He's creating the poem simply because he loves the poetry. And it's beautiful. And you know, when you hear poems from Shakespeare, you know, that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. That's a wonderful piece of poetry. The sound of the words dusty death. You know, he could have just said life sucks and then we die. That would be the practical way to say it. But the fact that he creates that wonderful piece of poetry, the use of words, the rolling sounds of Macbeth's lament, that is an amazing piece. And it speaks to an impracticality about the use of words, which reminds me of Bombadil. Bombadil is extremely impractical. If they gave him the ring, he'd probably lose it, as Gandalf later says, and not even notice that he'd done so. And if, for instance, Bombadil is poetry or connected to poetry, then it seems as though his language would make sense there. But more to the point, it seems as though Tolkien is commenting on what poetry and the reflection on poetry does for a person in the constant struggle for power. You know, our daily existence, especially in the modern world, seems to be wrapped up in discussing things and politics and making sure we get it right and making sure everybody thinks we're professional and making sure that we're in control and everything's controlled and the house is clean and everybody knows where they're going and blah, blah, blah. Control. We're always trying to force control. We're always trying to force either other people to see our point or to vote our way. What we don't tend to do is we don't tend to simply say, wow, listen to this work. Listen, listen, listen. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It shines forth like shimmering from shook foil and gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Isn't that lovely? Yeah, it's impractical. So let's go back to our jobs. Bombadil represents, I think, Tolkien's reflection on this constant need for control, this constant struggle to be right all the time, which, by the way, is connected to our ego. It's connected to the inflation of our ego. When we read a piece of poetry, we no longer are able to say, I'm the greatest thing in the world. No, sing, muse, of the wrath of Achilles that cost the Achaeans so many countless losses, murderous, doomed, sent great men down to the house of death, but their bodies food for the dogs and the birds. Now, that's great. In fact, that's greater than I am or you are. And my ego, in comparison to that poetry that's been around for a long time, gets greatly diminished. I think Tolkien was also very aware of the idea that poetry itself, the words, were connected to something mystical, something that was continuous, even beyond this world. When you read his Silmarillion, and you should, when you read his Silmarillion, what you find is that the creation of the entire world is due to a poem, is due to song. When Ea sings the song of creation, the world comes into existence. And as a matter of fact, the very fall of the bright angel, of Melkor, the bright angel, is due to the fact that he wanted a poem or song of his own making. He wanted to control the song. I think Tolkien is tapping into the idea here, or is entertaining the idea here, that our words, our poems, are only a fraction of a much greater poem, if you will, or song that's beyond this world. A pattern that we only see occasionally when we step back from that pattern of control, when we relinquish the need to be right all the time, and just delight in the fact that the world is a bright blue day. Simply reflect and delight, take joy in the fact that we're getting older. Simply take delight in our own children, or delight in our spouses, delight in good food and beer, or coconut milk. And stop trying to be God all the time. That's what I think Bombadil actually is. He's not John the Baptist. No, he's this representation of something in Tolkien's secondary world, which is part of the nature of mythology. That mythology frequently presents us with things that are inexplicable, not under our control, our understanding. Why? Because the world itself is not under our control. It's not entirely in our understanding. And the sooner that we are able to understand that, the sooner we're able to accept that, the easier it is, the sooner it is that we're able to get rid of that focus of control, which is the ring itself. So anyway, I hope that this answers questions that you have about this character. I hope it raises questions in wonder, because all philosophy begins in wonder. And I hope that you have enjoyed it. I've overshot my time here by 16, 17 minutes now, and I apologize for that. If you had places to go, things to control, go control them. Otherwise, thanks very much for being with me today, and hopefully I'll do this again soon. This is kind of fun, as long as I know my stuff and pronounce Iluvatar correctly. So take care. God bless.